Hey, so recently a subscriber messaged me about a recent video that I made where I mentioned deadline style, which is where you just, as a comic book artist, sometimes you just have to put your head down and, just get that page done and then get the book done. And you're not getting caught up in the little details like, is that pinky finger drawn correctly or anything like that. And he mentioned that it kind of like shifted his thinking a little bit where up until this point he was putting a lot of time into just one drawing for like an Instagram post. And if he were to spend that much time on just one panel of a comic page, essentially the comic would probably never get done. So it kind of clicked for him a little bit where maybe spending less time on the minute details and just jumping into the page and sort of looking at the page as a whole. And I think it's one of the benefits of working on a comic book page and a comic book project, even if as an artist you don't really even want to pursue that professionally. I think it's one of the more challenging areas of commercial art, making comics. Not because it's any kind of like higher art or anything like that, or that it's any more or less sophisticated than any other kind of commercial art, but more because there's just a lot more volume of drawing. And with comics, you're called upon to draw a variety of different things. So given the story that you're illustrating, you might have to draw a car, a cityscape, and perhaps like a horse all on the same page, let alone the same issue. So those drawing challenges, you have to figure out a way to sort of rise to the occasion and do it in a way where you're not going to draw perfect horses and perfect buildings and perfect cars on that page. You still want them to look good, but more importantly, you just want them to read as what they're supposed to be. So if the car looks like, it might be a go-kart, and the horse looks like a donkey, and the buildings look like they're houses, then you didn't do your job. So it's less about how cool or how detailed or how fancy you draw those things, and more about how easy they are for the reader to recognize them as what they're supposed to be. Because again, in comics, ultimately you're trying to just tell the story and move the story along. Sometimes when I was living in New York, I would watch people read comics on the subway if I was like standing over them and they were reading a comic. It was a very interesting experience because on the one hand, it was cool to see people reading comics, but then on the other hand, it was kind of soul crushing to see how little time a average comic reader spends on a page. So whether they were reading it digitally or a physical copy, I mean, you're really spending a matter of seconds on each page. And if you watch someone read a comic, their eyes are moving pretty quickly, their head is turning, they go to the next page, and then the page turns. And as a comic book artist, you're kind of like, oh man, I spent so much time on those drawings. I kind of want people to spend more time looking at them. But ultimately, you actually want them to move that fast, because if they have to stop and figure out, what is that? Is that a horse or is that a donkey or whatever stops them in their tracks? You don't want that to happen. You kind of just want them to get into that rhythm, because a good comic will put you into that rhythm where it starts to feel like the story is just kind of happening, and it starts to feel like a much more of like a passive experience, like you're not actively having to figure things out. So think about that the next time you're trying to labor over a little corner of a panel. Figure out whether that thing that you're trying to labor over is going to stop the reader in their tracks and take them out of the story. And if the answer is yes to that, then I would say to definitely put some time into clearing that up. But if it's more of like what I would call like a vanity issue or something like that, like you feel as though you could draw that thing better, if you only had so much more time, and you probably could if you did have that amount of time, but with comics, time is of the essence. Most of the time, you just kind of have to get it done and figure out a way to create a style, like I mentioned in one of my recent videos, where you're able to get the job done and it still looks what you think to be cool or interesting for the reader. So that's sort of why I mentioned that, even if you're not looking to pursue comics professionally, it might be an interesting exercise to try to work on even just a comic page or perhaps like a 5-page story, just to see if there's something that you can take out of that experience. I feel like comics will definitely, as an artist, definitely kind of like check your ego or humble you in some ways, because again, there's certain things that you can get away with or indulge yourself with if you're working on, say, like a cover or a single illustration. But with comics, you have to be very clever, and it's almost like you're working against the clock and trying to do your best artwork at the same time. And those two things are kind of opposing ideas. But when you're able to kind of figure out that equation, on the other end can come out something really interesting. And so going back to my subscriber, what he mentioned, kind of laboring over just a small illustration for an Instagram post, for instance. I feel like the process of creating a comic, at the end of it, you could come out learning much more about your style and perhaps developing as an artist much more than, laboring over something that somebody's just going to scroll through very quickly. So cool. That's just my thought of the day as it pertains to a working comic book artist and deadlines. If you have anything you want to chime in on this topic, definitely leave it in the comments down below. I'd love to hear what you think of comic deadlines, and as an artist, if that's challenging or easy for you or whatever it might be. And thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.